Shalom Chaverim, good evening. I'm Gadi Levi, I'm the director of the Temple Emmanuel Stryker Center, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome you this evening to the third in our series of Conversations we Design in partnership with the ADL and the Israel Policy Forum to help us understand and overcome our divisions over Israel. Israel, of course, at Temple Emmanuel and at the Stryker Center is a passion. So we are proud not only to present programs like tonight's, but the best of Israeli music, films, and literature, to give you the opportunity to both enjoy and engage in critical discussions, and even travel with us from Tel Aviv to the Negev. We still have many programs this semester, so I encourage you to take a catalog on the way out, and please join us again. But I do want to highlight one program that is very close to our hearts, which I hope you will join us. Please take a look.
Divided Jerusalem, 1967. A new song, a bittersweet plaint of longing for the ancient city from which Jews have been barred for 2 decades, erupted on the airwaves.
ירושלים של זהב ושל נחושת ושל אור, עלו לכל שירייך אני כינור.
3 weeks later, the Six-Day War broke out, and the dream of a united Jerusalem seemed poised to become reality.
ברגע זה אנו עוברים את שער האריות. אנחנו בתוך העיר העתיקה.
As Israeli troops pushed back the Jordanian army and reached the Western Wall, they spontaneously began singing those verses. For Israel's 71st Independence Day, the Temple Emmanuel Stryker Center is honored to welcome Lina Tan, who introduced the iconic song that reminds us why we can never forsake Jerusalem.
אוויר הרים צלול כיין וריח אורני נישא מרוח ארבעים עם כל פעמונים ירושלים של זהב ושל נחושת ושל אור.
Don't you feel like singing? Nice. I hope you'll join us on May 10th to hear Lina Tan and hear more about Jerusalem of Gold. Tonight's panel, we'd love to hear your questions. If you have a question, we will pass around these pieces of paper. Please write your question and give it to one of the staff people before we take questions. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, to begin tonight's discussion, I will turn things over to Suzy Gelman, board chairs of the Israel Policy Forum. Here's Suzy.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight's conversation is the final installment here at the Stryker Center of what has been an excellent Across the Divide series, a program that has thus far showcased constructive debates in which we have heard from an array of distinguished panelists across the generational and political divides. We at Israel Policy Forum have been delighted to partner in this series with the Stryker Center and with the ADL. And we're delighted to continue this series alongside the ADL next week in Washington, D.C., next month in Los Angeles, and beyond. But before this series leaves New York, we have 4 extraordinary panelists with us here this evening who are certain not to disappoint as they take a deep dive into examining the denominational divides in our community when it comes to discourse on Israel. Of course, we are convening this program just 2 days after a significant Israeli election that is likely to impact Israel's future direction on issues of peace and security, issues that are of deep concern to Israel Policy Forum and to our mission to support a viable two-state solution that ensures Israel's security. The election is also likely to impact the direction of issues like religious pluralism and shared values, which have been at the forefront of concern for many of us in the American Jewish community. In fact, Benjamin Netanyahu appears poised to establish another right-wing government in Israel. A newly constituted right-wing government may consider advancing annexation of the West Bank, undermining any future chance at a two-state solution. And, as is expected, a solidly right-wing coalition is formed. The new government is unlikely to even pay lip service, let alone advance support for any issues related to religious pluralism. These possibilities risk creating a greater divide between Israel and American Jews generally, as well as deepen the existing divides within our own community. As coalition negotiations get underway in Israel, I cannot think of a more timely moment to convene tonight's discussion. Israel Policy Forum's goal in pursuing the series has always been to expose diverse audiences to arguments outside of our individual bubbles. We firmly believe that a constructive discourse on Israel is both important and necessary, and that by elevating the discourse on these issues, by having a more forthright conversation, our community and our support for Israel as a Jewish and democratic state will be strengthened. So thank you all again for being here tonight. It is now my great pleasure to introduce John Harris, who's the National Civil Rights Chair of the ADL. John will be introducing tonight's panel. And again, thank you for coming, and I look forward to sharing a really interesting evening with all of you. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is John Harris, and I am the chair of ADL's National Civil Rights Committee. ADL is an organization founded in 1913 to defend the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. We are a global leader in fighting anti-Semitism, exposing extremism, delivering anti-bias education, and combating hate online. With a network of 25 offices around the country and one in Jerusalem, ADL is the first call when an anti-Semitic incident occurs. ADL advocates for the security and well-being of the State of Israel and actively supports the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We engage in a variety of efforts to counter the BDS movement and other international efforts to delegitimize Israel, and advocate and educate on issues relating to Israeli democracy, religious pluralism, and anti-discrimination across Israeli society. Because maintaining a strong relationship between the United States and Israel is high on ADL's agenda, ADL has partnered with the Israel Policy Forum and Temple Emmanuel Stryker Center to present this three-part series examining the divides within the U.S. Jewish community on Israel. We are also excited that we are exporting these conversations to other cities around the country. We are privileged tonight to have with us an esteemed panel of experts, all rabbis, representing multiple Jewish denominations and religious views. To my far left, I believe, to my right is Heshi Billet, the rabbi of Young Israel of Woodmere, having served there for 39 years. Ordained by Yeshiva University, where he was also awarded an honorary degree in 2016, Rabbi Billet is a past president of the Rabbinical Council of America and sits on the board of the City of David and the Western Wall Heritage Foundation. Rabbi Joshua Davidson is the senior rabbi here at Congregation Emmanuel. Ordained by the Hebrew Union College, Rabbi Davidson serves on the board of directors of the Kavod Tzedakah Collective and is a member of the Hebrew Union College Board of Governors. He has written extensively on Jewish issues, and his articles have appeared among other publications, Jewish Week Commentary and the Huffington Post. Rabbi Lauren Holtzblatt is the co-senior rabbi at Adas Israel Congregation in Washington, D.C. Ordained by JTS, Rabbi Holtzblatt was named one of the Forward's 32 most inspiring rabbis in the country and is the recipient of the Schusterman Fellowship. She previously served as the Hillel Foundation Director of Campus Initiatives and as Associate Rabbi at the Yale Hillel. David Wolkenfeld is the rabbi of Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel Congregation in Chicago. David has 3 different rabbinic ordinations, including from Yeshivat Hovevei Torah, and previously served on the executive committee of the Rabbinical Council of America. He currently serves as a vice president of the International Rabbinic Fellowship and is a member of the executive committee of the Chicago Board of Rabbis. And tonight's moderator is Melissa Weintraub, the co-founding executive director of Resetting the Table, an organization dedicated to building dialogue and deliberation across political divides. Ordained by JTS, Melissa was the founding director of Encounter, an organization focused on strengthening the capacity of the Jewish people to be agents of change in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Tonight's conversation should be a fascinating one. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. What an extraordinary panel we have. Hi, everyone. So there was a big election a couple days ago, and I'm sure that is on everyone's minds. And we have this richly diverse group of religious leaders, rabbis, here together. And that gives us a unique opportunity. We will circle back around to the election, don't worry. But that gives us a unique opportunity to get at some of the religious motivations and commitments that are shaping the American, Jewish, and Israeli political landscapes that really underlie a lot of the conversation in ways that are not always exposed or unearthed or talked about, and are often left out of policy discussions, really at the loss of a lot of insight about what's happening and where we go from here. So we're going to bring into focus some of that religious language. And I want to, before I get into my opening questions, I want to set them up with a quick anecdote. I was in a session a few years ago, and a rabbi who identifies as a religious Zionist rabbi said, if only I ever heard liberal Jews talking about the Kedusha, the holiness of the land of Israel, it would be so much easier to hear everything else that they have to say. And there was a progressive rabbi who was present who said, if only I ever heard right-leaning religious Zionist leaders talking about the sanctity of all of the people living on this land, including Palestinians. It would be so much easier to hear everything else that they have to say. Now, I want to kind of recognize that this is a false binary, and that it's hugely reductionist, and I think it gets us into some of the mutual perceptions, perhaps projections, that different streams have about what others hold most sacred, and what's front and center. And so we have a unique opportunity to get underneath these assumptions and to be in conversation with each other. So I'm going to start out by throwing open to all of you. Do you see this land as holy? Do you see the land of Israel as holy? And do you see our ancestral connection to the land as mattering politically? The fact that the covenantal promise that was made to Abraham that Abraham's descendants would inherit the land, does that have political significance?
Well, I actually think that's 2 different questions.
They're very different questions, and pick up whichever one you're drawn to.
So our ancestral connection to the land is historically beyond dispute. We know that there is evidence of Israelite civilization in the land that was Canaan and became Eretz Yisrael, reaching back 3,000 years. That's different than a covenantal promise. The question of whether God promised the land to the Jewish people is a source of considerable political conflict. The challenge for us is to, I believe, separate those two items. Our presence there is beyond dispute. The question of whether God promised the land to us is not a basis for any sort of compromise with people who hold a different narrative.
Can you say one or two sentences more, a little bit more? What's at stake in that distinction that you're making that's so important? It's about the exclusive, like the absolutism of the claim as you see it, if it's a promise?
When the biblical writers, I would argue, attempted to inculcate an identity in the people for whom they were writing, for whom they were speaking, an identity of commitment to one God, and they root the claim to the land in a divine pledge, then that makes it impossible to dispute. Today, that is a source of considerable conflict, obviously, when you're attempting to negotiate how that land ought to be shared with people who hold a different narrative.
Well, it depends where you're coming from. I believe, I'm an Orthodox rabbi, and I have Orthodox training, and I believe in the sanctity of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. And in the 5 books of Moses, God promises Abraham, "L'zaracha aten et haaretz hazot," I will give this land to your children. So I do believe that there was a commitment from God to Abraham, and there was a covenant between God and Abraham, which was further enhanced by a covenant between God and the Jewish people after the exodus from Egypt at Mount Sinai. So I do that's what I believe. I mean, I'm not saying that's what everyone has to believe, but I do believe there's a covenantal connection. I do believe there's a historical connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. I do believe there is strong archaeological evidence that there was a temple on Mount Moriah, and the Jewish people worshipped God in a particular kind of way. So I do think that there is a special connection. If you observe the Orthodox halakha, you treat the land of Israel in a certain kind of way. You tithe your fruits and vegetables. You observe the Shemitah year, the year in which the land rests. I mean, there are certain things that make that when we speak of the land of Israel, we speak of Kedushat Haaretz, the sanctity of the land. We respect the sanctity of the land from that perspective. And I just want to get to the point you made about the people. I, for one, believe that all people are the same. All people are created in the image of God, and that there's no difference between the life of a Palestinian person and the life of a Jewish person. So I don't feel the need of this. I think there's something called Kedushat HaChaim, the sanctity of life, and that belongs to everybody. So I don't agree with either party. I mean, I don't think anyone has to believe that the land of Israel is sacred. I do, but people could disagree with that. And I think all people are sacred. So I don't have any problem saying that. And that's how I view your anecdote.
I believe with almost everything you just said is true. See, we knew we liked each other from the beginning, right?
Well, now, we don't want to start,
I know,
from the
no,
5
yeah, I
towns, you don't
know.
want to start
Yeah,
rumors.
absolutely. I think for me, I guess what's helpful for me in thinking through this question, absolutely the sanctity of the land, absolutely that this land was promised. But then I think this is also how I think about halachic literature, is that if we live only in a book, and we don't live in the land with the people to see what is surrounding us, who are the people that have been living there, who have had multiple stories there, who have multiple claims to the land, and we don't live in the actuality of what's there, and we're talking only about a sanctification of a book, that's where I divide. It seems to me there's an Eretz Yisrael in the Jewish imagination which can be a sanctified imagination of what the land is and what it stands for and what was promised to Avram when God said, Lech lecha, go to this land that I'm going to show you. But then there's an actuality of what's there, of thousands of years of people laying claim to that particular place. And there's a Medina now, there's a place that we actually have to negotiate what having sovereignty looks like, what living in the land looks like, where you draw lines of who, what belongs to the Commonwealth of Israel and what belongs in a future Palestinian state. And to me, I feel like the problem is we often live in the imagination and not on the ground. And for me, that's where I think I like to differentiate of we need to live in between both.
And thanks for sharing such stimulating thoughts. I could listen to you discuss for a while, but I'm supposed to also contribute some ideas of my own. So I want to just offer the perspective. I think, yes, I do believe that God gave Eretz Yisrael to the Jewish people, but I don't believe that confers political rights, even though I do believe it's politically relevant in at least two ways. If you look at even Abraham himself, who received the promise from God that his ancestors would live in the land, still didn't assume any property rights and still felt that he had to live amongst the non-Jews who were there at the time with sort of the same sort of ethical practice as though he were living anywhere else. This is actually in the Midrash one of the differences between Abraham and Lot. Lot thought, my uncle was promised this land, so my sheep can graze in others' pastures. I don't have to worry about their property rights. And Abraham instructed his shepherds to value the property rights, even though, of course, he believed in that divine promise. And I also don't think the historical fact that someone's ancestors lived somewhere hundreds of years ago or thousands, I don't think that conveys any sort of property rights or political rights. I don't think we live that way. If the Jebusites were to come back and say, hi, we've been gone for 4,000 years, we want a piece of Jerusalem, I don't think we would be open to that. And certainly if the native peoples who lived where my apartment is today, I don't think I would so easily give them even though, again, there's some a lot of validity to their claim to my corner of Chicago, but that's not translated into property rights. I do think the Jewish ancestral tie to the land of Israel, which I believe was given to, started by a divine promise, is politically relevant in two ways. One, I think that's what inspired thousands and thousands of Jews to uproot themselves and move to Eretz Yisrael at a time when there wasn't a state there, and to build a Jewish homeland there, as opposed to other places that were more, perhaps perceived at the time to be more pragmatic, right? Zionism historically was a very pragmatic movement. All the great Zionists supported the Uganda plan. The religious Zionists supported the Uganda plan, but it didn't capture the imagination of the Jewish people in the way that going back to Eretz Yisrael did. So it was very politically relevant that we used to live there and that God promised that we would one day live there again. That historically was very important in modern times. And it's also, I think it's in terms of living together with Palestinians and working towards peace, it's important, I think, that we recognize one another's narrative, and when there are voices in the Palestinian community that deny a Jewish historical connection to the land of Israel, that's a barrier to be overcome, because that's denying part of who we are and our identity, and so when there are those voices, those are very, I think, harmful voices, and I think that's also a very politically relevant thing to notice and call out and confront those voices on the other side as well. If I can circle back to your opening question about the Kedusha, the sanctity of the land, so of course there's a halachic sanctity, there's a halachic expression of the sanctity of the land of Israel and sort of the mitzvot that can be performed there. I also feel very special when I'm in Israel, and I was a student in Israel for 3 years and visited it some other times as well, and that's probably less than some of you and more than others of you. I feel very, very special when I am in Israel, but I have come to recognize that special feeling for me is mostly generated from living in a Jewish society, in a Hebrew-speaking society where Jewish culture is so dominant, and I think it's less about the fact that my ancestors also lived in that place thousands of years ago. 10 years ago, I most recently lived in Jerusalem. My family were Jews paying members at 2 wonderful synagogues. We loved the rabbis. We thought they were compelling. We loved the prayers there. The tefillah was inspiring and beautiful. Tremendous Torah was studied in those congregations. We loved the neighborhood where we lived, and I rarely went, to the Kotel that year because it seemed so much more compelling to have a synagogue with a really powerful, inspiring message of Judaism, and that to me is something that the state of Israel and Jews coming back to one place from so many other places and a vibrant Hebrew culture promotes and makes possible. So that to me, that's the sanctity that I want to protect, that I want to invest in, that I want to soak up. And I think that there are some who would say that thriving Hebrew society, that thriving Israel, could be compromised by a devotion to Israeli sovereignty over every corner of Eretz Yisrael, right? And so I think what's alive and what's fresh, what's vibrant seems worth protecting more than which flag is on which hilltop.
So there's so much that we could dig into already, including you just elaborated quite a bit about what the sanctity of the land means to you, and I think others talked about the sanctity without talking about what it actually means to you. So you may want to bring that back in, but I want to kind of shine a light on some alignment and I think a difference that emerged. So you started us out with this distinction. And all of you talked about the importance of our ancestral tie, our ancestral connection. But it sounded like, Josh, that it was important to you to say that if we start talking about divine promises, that we have to look at the consequences of that, and this is in large part why religious languages are often left out of policy discussions, because there's an assumption that will lead to a zero-sum game, that will lead to an inability to compromise. And I want to point out that the two of you, and possibly also you, Heshi, talked about the divine promise and held it in tension with other values, other ways of seeing things, that we can have. We can believe that this land was promised and still not believe that confers political rights, or that we have to reconcile this with the current political reality and another people's claim, or with the sanctity of life. Did I capture? Yes. Okay. So I want to see, and Heshi, and I also would love to hear from you whether you think that the promise does or doesn't kind of translate into political claim, because I don't think you really fully address that. And you can come back to it. I'm going to throw out a question for all of you, and you can still pull that in. The question for all of you is this: what have we not gotten on the table so far in terms of Jewish concepts, Jewish teachings that most inform your lens on Israel, your relationship to Israel? What have you not said about Jewish concepts and teachings that are at the heart of it for you? Please bring that in as well. And you can lead us off, since I directed a question to you.
Okay, well, I want to go back to actually something that Rabbi Davidson said, that Josh said.
Great.
About the history, and not about the religious aspect. I happen to be I believe that the history is very, very important. And in fact, I think the obligation to know history, I think, is almost religiously ordained. You know, in where God says, or Moses tells us, "Zachor yemot olam binu shnot dor v'dor." Remember the days of the world and understand the years of the generations. And you know, from my perspective, besides the long historical narrative that we could cite of the Jewish people connected to the land and never leaving the land except when they were driven into the Babylonian exile, but living in the land the entire period, otherwise small Jewish communities and Jews always coming back to the land of Israel. I think the modern history is something that sometimes gets a little bit distorted. Someone mentioned the word, I think it was David mentioned the word narrative. There's a Palestinian narrative and there's a Jewish narrative. And I think it's very, very important when you're historical that you have to be accurate. And as I've tried to study both the Jewish and the Palestinian narrative, I have some issues with the Palestinian narrative, but I don't know if that's for me to bring up now or I should keep that for later.
I think it's the question about what
I
Jewish concepts and teachings kind of most inform. What is at the heart of it for you? So with the historical narrative, what does that historical narrative and record teach you, give you?
It's very, very hard to split yourself into pieces. I mean, if you're a religious person, and a lot of people, and I don't call a religious person an Orthodox person. I'm talking about a religious person. If you're a religious person, that's part of your persona. That's part of what you are. And the decisions that you make in the world, you make decisions both as a human being, and you also make decisions as a religious person, because the religion is so much a part of who you are. And so it's very, very difficult to relate to something like Israel for a religious person, and just saying, well, I'm not going to look at Israel from a religious perspective. I have to. But my religious perspective about Israel has a lot to do with history, because I think history is a religious responsibility, and it's a human responsibility also to know history. So, I mean, I'll leave my comments about narratives, about the specific narratives for maybe later in the discussion, but I have some very strong views on the Palestinian narrative, which I consider in large part, not completely, but large parts of the Palestinian narrative are a false narrative. And I'm trying to say that as objectively as I can, and I could at least demonstrate that from my point of view. I just want to give other people a chance to talk.
So for me, there are two concepts that shape my lens on Israel. One of them I've talked about, the Bible being a product of Jewish history as opposed to being Jewish history itself. The second is the pursuit of justice. The establishment of the State of Israel is the greatest act of restorative justice for a persecuted people the world has ever known. Period. The government of the State of Israel also needs to govern with justice. So I hold those two ideas together in the way, politically anyway, I think about the State of Israel today.
That's so beautifully said. I agree. Okay. I think what's coming to mind, what happens in chapter 12 of Bereshit, when Abraham is given this promise of this land, and then he goes to the land, and then he gets there, and immediately what happens when he arrives, there's a famine in the land, and he has to leave and go to Mitzrayim. And, I laugh, but the thing is that I think, for me, that actually, I think it's, like I said before, there's a dream of what one wants to have happen there, right? A dream of what a smooth transition of moving into a land and having it be what you want it to be, and then the reality on the ground of what it means to actually live in that land and to work on that land. And that, look, I mean, his travel down to Mitzrayim also has him engaged with the neighbors that are living around him. There's a little trickery there, but they do end up developing, some relationships, and so that he can go back to the land and settle in the land. But I think part of that is both having a vision of what something you want to be, and then getting to the land and the actual reality of what the land is, which is much harder than I think what our visions are. So that's one piece, is that just this idea, like I said before, of both being dreamers, as the psalmist says, right? We need to be like dreamers, but also needing to be in the reality of what that land even was biblically, right? What the Torah is teaching us about what the reality was when Avram entered the land. The other thing that I think is just timely for us right now, we're very close to Pesach. Hopefully no one's freaking out in the audience right now. You should only clean, well, I won't make psak halacha for you, but you don't have to clean where you don't eat.
So I have a lot of cleaning to do.
But one of the things about the Seder, which I think, for me, really, it goes back to this issue of justice and what it means to rule with justice and have a government and a land that has a light, that has a specific light to give to the world about what it means to live in this land, in this special place. Is that we don't, when we're going through the Haggadah, we're not, we start with halach ma'anya. We start with the bread of affliction. We start as slaves. But by the time we get to the meal, we begin Hallel, and when we come back from the meal, we finish Hallel. And we go to Kos Eliyahu, and we say, Lishana haba b'Yerushalayim. And we begin as slaves, but when we exit that Seder, what we ritually have done is we've been redeemed, right? We've left Mitzrayim. And it seems to me that there's what is asked of us in that leaving of Mitzrayim, of a place of our narrowness, is that we're asked to embody radical empathy. That's what's asked of us. Again and again and again in the Torah, we are told that we have to remember that we were slaves in Egypt. And so when we have a land, when we are in this position of power, that we have to remember that. And we have to treat the people, the Gerim, the strangers that live around us, with love, not only with respect, but actually with love. And I think sometimes we still, in our narrative, in our psychological minds, we're still in the first part of the Seder. We never leave being avadim and enter into, in this geula of redemption. And I think that's a tricky place for us to live. We have to actually look at what does it mean to have power, and what do we do with that power once we have it.
So I'm going to list three important Jewish concepts that are implicated in my relationship to Israel. I don't think that I haven't said yet. They haven't really been expressed yet. The first is this notion of Klal Yisrael, of Jewish peoplehood. For someone who lives a thick Jewish life, according to the Jewish calendar, Shabbat and holidays and Tefillah, whether in Chicago or New York or in DC, I think for myself, I can't not feel a connection to the home of, half of the Jews in the world and the society that they've built and the culture that they've created there. That's super important. My first trip to Israel, I was 14 years old, almost 15. I think I saved all of the napkins from the falafel stands because they had Hebrew writing on them. It was so neat to me that I think that's one element. Second, Torah study is core to my sense of what it means to be a Jew. That's one of the things we do best. That's one of the core of my spiritual life and my intellectual life. And Israel makes possible Torah scholarship, not just in a narrow sense of religious texts, but Torah scholarship, including history and the celebration and creation of Jewish culture. There's something in Israel each spring called Shvat HaSefer, the Hebrew Book Week, when all of the publishing houses publish their new books, and in all of the city squares there are book fairs where each publishing house has its table, and there's at least in Jerusalem, there's a religious fair, and there's one that the general publishing houses produce. And it's been some years since I've been able to be there. The timing hasn't aligned for me, but
it's at the train station now.
And that's very nice.
Rishona.
Oh, fun.
Yes.
So for me, that Shvat HaSefer is constitutive of my Zionism in some ways more than the Kotel. Maybe it's a little bit extreme, but this is something created by millions of Jews living together and creating this vibrant, dynamic Jewish Hebrew culture and civilization, and the scholarship of all kinds that has ensued is really inspiring to me and really important. The third thing is a word that you mentioned just now, the word redemption, and Israel and Zionism are connected to redemption in a way that, for me, I actually feel conflicted about, so I'll share my conflict. On the one hand, I think I'm a rationalist, and I see Zionism as a secularizing move of the Jewish people, a decision that we made that we were going to return to politics, to return to history, to return to statecraft, that we weren't going to live on an entirely religious, spiritual plane, but that we're going to, let's return to the world and take responsibility for our own lives and our own future in this way. And insofar as that is what Zionism represented, it doesn't necessarily have much to do with redemption as a religious concept. It's redemption as a national, secular concept. And the earliest religious Zionists were of this mindset. Rabbi Reines, the founder of the religious Zionist party, the Mizrahi party, took out ads in newspapers saying Zionism has nothing to do with redemption. This is just a pragmatic effort to improve the condition of the Jewish people who are in danger and impoverished, and that speaks to me a great deal. I remember once, Rabbi Chaim Bravender, my first Rosh Yeshiva, was asked, how do you feel comfortable when praying for Israel, saying the phrase, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, referring to Israel as the first flowering of our redemption? Isn't that presumptuous? How do you know? And Rabbi Bravender responded, he said, it's called a prayer, was his response, meaning it's a hope. That's why we're praying. It's not presumptuous. We're not stating something as fact. It's a hope for what it could be, and that also speaks to me. And in my more mystical moments, I do feel that this return of the Jewish people to our ancestral homeland, to the Promised Land, does which is something that the prophets did predict would be a harbinger of redemption, does have that portent, indeed, of being Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, that first flowering of our redemption. And recently I've come to wonder that maybe in this complicated way that we've returned to the land, and it's other people already living there, and maybe that's that redemptive challenge to overcome. I think certainly the focus of the world, this obsession of the world on Israel and on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is beyond all proportion of other conflicts in the world, or et cetera. I think that if we could actually make peace with our neighbors, if Israelis could make peace with Palestinians in this center point of the world, I think that would transform the world. I think that example, that inspiring example, would really, people of faith, Jews and Muslims in this Holy Land, with Christians too, if they could make peace, I think it would really transform the world in a way that that really could be considered something redemptive.
I just there were a couple of things that were said. I just make a very, very brief comment. One thing was about love. The way I see love.
Your microphone.
Just a few comments about a few things that were said. Very brief. Love. I see love as a two-way street. I mean, we as the Jews always try to I think we have a strong ethical and moral imperative. That's any way you understand the Bible and the Torah and what it means to be a Jew is to be moral and to love, and you're supposed to love other people, all human beings. But love is a two-way street. I mean, if people expect love, they have to love back. That's number one. And secondly, about ruling with justice. And look, Israel is a democracy. People might disagree about which party should be in power, and we could think of all the ways they could do things better. But the fact of the matter is, it is a democracy. It's the only real democracy in the Middle East, and it's not perfect. No democracy is perfect. No human institution is perfect because people aren't perfect. But Israel is a democracy, and it does run on the basis of morality. Sometimes they make serious mistakes. They don't live up to obligations, such as the Kotel Agreement, which I think has to be lived up to. That's an obligation. It was made by the government. It was made by the Haredim. It was made by everyone. Okay, so there is a shortcoming. But the fact of the matter is, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Israel is a democracy, and it's a pulsating place, and it's a place where you could say whatever you want. You could say whatever you want about the prime minister. I mean, I don't think you could say shoot the prime minister, but you could say whatever you want about the prime minister and disagree. I think it's a model.
Okay, so you've all said many beautiful and profound things. And Heshi, you've started to get at how even if one affirms a value like love and justice, it needs to be held in tension for you with other values or with a love of self, essentially, that demands reciprocity, right? That demands that we are loved in return, and so that we can protect ourselves. I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth. Am I?
Don't worry.
Okay.
You're safe.
All right.
We're not convening a bet then after this and putting you in Cherem. You're
okay,
good.
Okay, well, I aspire to a higher bar than that. I don't want to misrepresent you. But I want to actually come back to something that you were taking us into a conversation about redemption and how we interpret the redemptive potential of Israel's existence. And I'm going to ask something I was going to ask later, but you kind of took us there. And this is primarily a question for you and for Heshi, though anyone can respond. What do you say to those who say, and primarily religious Zionists who would say, how could we see this history? Like, look at the unfolding reality around us. Look at 48, look at 67. How can we see this as anything other than the expression of divine will? Like, this is not a mere interpretation of text. This is the observation of reality. And how could we think? It is utterly nonsensical to think that removing Jews from the heart of biblical Judaism could possibly yield peace. Like, what do you say to that? Does that resonate with you? Do you find it compelling? Do you find it objectionable? And part of the reason I'm bringing this voice into the room is I'm not hearing it yet on our panel, and it's a hugely influential voice and set of voices that are not often heard in American Jewish communities, and that we need, I think, to grapple with, to talk to illuminate. So I'd love to hear how you're in conversation with that voice, either within yourself or outside yourself.
Want me to talk? I'll talk first then. I'm going to tell you a little Dvar Torah, a little Torah thought, but to make the point. You know, Maimonides says that one of his principles of faith is, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah. Maimonides also says that the Jewish people will not be redeemed unless they repent. So Rabbi Soloveitchik asked, how could you say with perfect faith, you believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, if the Jewish people don't repent, they won't be redeemed? So how could you say that with perfect faith? So Rabbi Soloveitchik says, Maimonides adds one thing. He says, and there's a promise that the Jewish people will repent. So my relationship to history is really more through the Jewish people than it is to, some big belief in God's promises. And so that to me is a very, very important thing. Where are the Jewish people? Where did the Jewish people come from? And I grew up in my teachers were people who believed in trading land for peace, but trading land for peace for real peace, not trading land to peace to be bombed to pieces and to be destroyed. I think that one might say, just in terms of the modern history of the state of Israel, Israel has made many attempts to make peace, and they've made many concessions. And not only the withdrawal from Gaza, they've made many, many concessions to make peace, and all they've gotten back are bombs. So we were always demanding of Israel that Israel make more and more and more concessions. Israel is smaller than the state of New Jersey, and Israel has a very narrow waistline if you make more and more and more concessions. So you have to know that you're getting real peace for concessions. I do believe that the Jewish people, there's no question that there are some people on the right of the political aisle and who are deeply passionate and what some people like to call messianic in their views, that aren't prepared to do anything. But I think the majority of the people in Israel, including the majority of the people living in Judea and Samaria, which is controversial. I guess the Golan Heights is no longer controversial. No, but it's been annexed. But I think the majority of the people of Israel were ready to make concessions for real peace, and you have to see some reciprocity.
So I think there are many who aren't, and those voices are voices that I hear a lot, and I've lived amongst people like that, and I think I've had like a 20-year dialogue with individuals who, either their political analysis is such that they would never be tempted by, is this a real, there would never be a peace offer that would be so good in their eyes that they would feel compelled to enter into that balance, or they feel that Jewish settlement in every corner of the historic Eretz Yisrael is more important than political negotiations. I think that's a voice that's a prominent voice. I don't know, it's a majority, minority, it's a prominent voice. I think, to me, again, the pragmatic element of Zionism is an important counter voice, that historically Zionism was a pragmatic movement about achieving real things in the here and now, and to jeopardize that on this messianic vision, I think seems foolish to me. Religiously, I think that we should always be suspicious whenever there is any action that would be foolish or unwise or harmful to oneself or harmful to others, but we're going to do it anyway because we think God wants us to do that. I think that's a very risky stance to take religiously. I'm not saying it never happens, but it's a very risky stance to take, and we should think very long and hard before adopting it. If something, Rav Kook says that the test of true Yirat Shamayim, true awe of God, and that is that it enhances and sanctifies our own innate sort of sense of morality and ethics. And I see my analysis of the current settlement movement, certainly the piece of it that is entrenched in hilltops deep in Judea and Samaria, with no intention on the part of those living there to leave those homes or to ever live as citizens of a Palestinian state. I think that and these are wonderful people, sincere people, warm people, caring people, doing what they think God wants them to do. But I think that endeavor is harmful. It inflicts harm on human beings right here, right now, and Palestinians, who it certainly, and I think it risks inflicting harm on the entire Zionist enterprise if the stable, status quo, which is very much in Israel's favor, maybe isn't as stable as we hope it is, or as it sometimes seems to be.
Oh, yeah.
I want to respond to your question because I was troubled by it. I think what I heard you ask was, how can one conceive of peace without Israel being allowed to live on its ancestral homeland? And how, after 48 and 67, can we not see God as somehow involved in this enterprise? And I don't think those are the same questions. I was only born in 68, but I understand how the Jewish community responded in 67 and couldn't help but feeling as if God had somehow delivered again the Jewish people. That's an emotional response and an understandable one. That's a very different question than asking how can one conceive of peace without the Jews being able to live on their ancestral home. And again, I have to separate the historic experience of the Jews on the land of Israel from this divine pledge. No matter how emotionally we may respond to the state of Israel's victories and its challenges, we've got to be able, I believe, to separate this notion of divine will from Israel's own courage and commitment and perseverance.
So I hear you about how crucial that distinction is. And to clarify, I was trying to channel a voice that I think needs to be heard, that I don't think I've heard anyone fully articulate on our panel, that would say that peace, removing Jews from this land cannot yield peace, because returning this land to the Jews is precisely what will usher in the time of redemption, right? So, and you want to get in here. I think
I can wait,
yeah.
but if you want, go.
I think I want to move us into, we have limited time and so much we could talk about, but I think that it's important for us to more directly touch political issues even than we're doing right now. And so I'm gonna take us there, and I hope you'll bring in what you were thinking about.
I'll find a way.
So translating these values into the messiness of politics, right? The complexity of politics. And this may be also a chance for you, Hashi, to talk about your reading of Jewish history. Not history, your reading of the historical record beyond Palestinian intransigence and non-recognition and aggression, et cetera. So, in theory, do you embrace a two-state paradigm? I'm going to ask you, each of you, to speak about this as individuals. In theory, do you embrace a two-state paradigm, of Palestinian and Israeli states living side by side, regardless of your thoughts about its current viability?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I just want to say, anecdotally, I just want to say a few things. I think the leadership on both sides, and not, certainly, the last 12 years, I think we've seen a very difficult time in terms of the peace process. But my first time in Bethlehem was with you, actually, Melissa. Before you started Encounter, I guess we were there for Pardes for a year at Pardes or something like that. And I asked you if you would take me with you to one of your dialogue groups that you were doing in Bethlehem. And we got in the bus on Rehov Beit Lechem, and we rode a van across the line. And I remember seeing what looked like refugee camps. as we got further and further into Bethlehem. And I remember seeing kids that were barefoot and walking, just in the streets, basically, and sitting around tables with Sabra Israelis who had come over with us into that dialogue group and having conversations about what it meant to feel pain and to actually feel what was going on, and years and years and years of pain. But there was the redemption of hope for me of a two-state solution was you had two people that were sitting across from each other and seeing them as human beings. And to me, I feel like no matter what is happening politically, it feels to me like it's a chiyuv, it's an obligation that we don't give up on the chance for peace, even when what we're looking at, and I don't deny that there are unbelievable difficulties in terms of security and what we're seeing from the other side, but I think we do it too. And I feel like it's an obligation for us to work towards this two-state solution.
So for the sake of time, I'm going to ask, is there anyone who would say that two states are no longer the goal?
I would say that two-state solution at this point in time, at this moment in time, is a dead solution, unless you talk about the second state being what was created by the British in 1922, and that is Transjordan, which is a majority Palestinian entity. I think that the failure of the Oslo process, and all that has gone on since Oslo, since 1993 until this moment, I don't think that the two-state solution is practical in terms of its implementation at this point in time. If in the best of all possible worlds there could really be a two-state solution, I don't think anyone would be, in what's called Israel. I don't think there's anyone, but with real peace, I don't think there's anyone who would object to it. But I don't think that two-state solution is really practical. And here is where history becomes important. Because originally, the Palestine Mandate that the British got covered all of what's called Israel today and all of what's called Jordan today. It was a tremendous, and that was really what was promised to the Jewish people by Lord Balfour, which came before, of course, the British taking over the mandate. It was changed in 1922. It was changed again on November 29, 1947, in the partition plan, which was voted in the UN, which the Jews once again accepted. And all the Jews got for anything that they've done, any concession they've made, was wars, was Palestinian irregulars attacking them between November 29, 1947 till May 15, 1948. And then May 15, 1948, you had regular Arab armies attacking them. That's all they've ever gotten. And I was alive in 1967, and I don't remember the Six-Day War as being something which I looked as a messianic redemption of the Jewish people. It was a very, very frightening time because everyone was afraid that they were going to drive us into the sea. People were concerned about survival then. And the miracle of the Six-Day War was that we weren't. I'm
going to jump in. I'm sorry to cut you off,
please.
But I do want to hear from others. And before you move on, what are your prescriptions? So the two-state solution is dead. This is your reading of history. What are your?
It's
where
dead
does that take
at
you?
this moment.
It's dead in this moment. Okay. And so does that mean, where does that leave us? Does that leave us with a conflict management perspective, with maintaining the status quo, or does that push you towards something else?
I have an answer, but it's going to take too long. But there are plenty of Palestinians who would be happy to live under Israeli rule. There was a conference this year in Brussels, right? There was a conference this year in Brussels in which numerous Palestinians, Bassem Eid, Mudar Zaran, spoke about, we wish we could live in Israel. We wish the Palestinian Authority would leave us alone because the Israelis treat us well. The refugee camps are horrible, but the refugee camps in Syria and in Jordan and in Lebanon are really horrible. I mean, in Israel, it's terrible. The refugee camps. I don't excuse the suffering.
We have to be responsible.
I once asked Dr. Shakiki, who is a Palestinian pollster. I met him in Ramallah actually last year. And I asked Dr. Shakiki, I said, between 1948 and 1967, the refugee camps were in Jordan. The Jordanians didn't do anything for them. From 1967 to 1993, they were under Israeli control. The Israelis wanted to knock down the refugee camps and they wanted to build housing for them, but the Palestinians wouldn't let them. But since 1993, millions upon millions of dollars were given to the Palestinian Authority, and they've done nothing for the refugee camps, which are under the area A, under Palestinian. They've done nothing. Can you explain to me why? And privately, he told me because the Palestinian Authority wants to use the Palestinians living in the refugee camps as political pawns. But he whispered that to me. He wouldn't answer the question publicly. He said it to me privately. He says, you know, Abu Mazen really would like to do something, but he can't because he needs these political pawns. So, I mean, I have more to say, but I have to let others talk.
Okay. So I think we have real differences here. And I want to give you, anyone else on the panel, a chance to respond. Differences likely of analysis of prescriptions.
I'll just share like a shift that occurred in my professional life when I started my career working on campus, where my relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was as an educator or in a pastoral role, where advising students or teaching students, who had questions about exercising their leadership on campus in various ways. Or one student asked me once, how sympathetic to the Palestinian cause can I be and still be an Orthodox Jew? He was asking that from a sociological perspective, from a religious perspective. And then I moved to Chicago, and all of a sudden I was involved in Federation and involved in AIPAC, and I wasn't relating to this issue as an educator so much as actually somebody who was participating in all sorts of like actual advocacy work. And what I discovered is that the two-state solution may be a good idea, maybe a bad idea, maybe a dead idea, but it's the foundation. It seems to still be the absolute foundation for Israel's international legitimacy and the entire basis of the pro-Israel movement in the United States, at least until very recently, was on promoting this two-state. So I don't know if it's, I'd say it's like the worst solution except for all the others. I don't know that. That's what I would say. So I agree. It doesn't seem to be on the horizon. I wish. I'm jealous of your interpretation and understanding of history that promotes such a pro-Israel vision. It would be much easier for me if I also understood history that way, but I see it more complicated. So that's my answer, though, on the two-state solution question. So.
I don't think anybody on this panel is going to argue that Israel is solely responsible for the status quo at all. That doesn't mean that the Israeli government can't do what it can so that down the road, when there is some semblance of reliability among a Palestinian partner, that two states can be achieved. I mean, right now, there isn't. But one day, inshallah, there will be. Let Israel do what it can now, not to make it harder down the road.
I also think, I was listening last night to Jeremy Ben-Ami. I see we have friends from J Street here. And he was interviewing, I don't remember their names, but two pollsters from Israel. And, one of the things that came up was the annexation of the West Bank. And Bibi's claim, Bibi's saying that he was going to do this if he won the election. And one of the pollsters was saying, it's really nothing new. He's been expanding these settlements for years. And so really it was just a public declaration of what's been going on for years and years and years. And so I just think, we say there's no partner and we say we've done X, Y, and Z. And yes, there is a lot that Israel has done to stretch out a hand. Look at the Barak years, or Oslo, or, there have been so many attempts that we can talk about through history. But I also think, there's a lot of ill will that's also gone on. There's a lot of bulldozing of houses that's gone on. And I think that also lives within a people. And we're responsible for that.
So part of what I'm hearing as a difference that kind of is emerging is around the extent of our agency. To what extent can we do anything, right? How can we proactively pursue peace, to what extent are we also culpable, even if we assign culpability to Palestinians? And I think Josh, I was kind of hearing echoes of something very eloquent that Danielle Hartman has said, that we may not be able to have peace now, but we have to ensure that we're not taking steps such that we couldn't have peace tomorrow. But I really want to thank you, Hashi, for kind of breaking open, kind of breaking a taboo and talking about, naming some of the things that you named. We're living in a time in which polls are showing that more Israelis seem to support annexation than support a two-state solution, even though it's not entirely clear what that means, because some say that they support both annexation of much of the West Bank and a two-state solution. We can read that as we will. So let me give you another voice that I haven't fully heard. You kind of got us closest. Naftali Bennett has been kind of a spokesperson for this point of view. May not have made it into the Knesset, but speaks for increasing numbers of Israelis. And has been hugely influential, and argues that the status quo is just unsustainable. If we think that it would be it would lead to Palestinian violence on our border in 2019, we're going to be having this conversation 50 years from now and talking about celebrating the 100th anniversary of temporary military rule. So we've already changed Israel's borders. And let's take something that is true already and extend Israeli sovereignty. So you may have already responded to this fully. That this would be like just completely undermine Israel's international legitimacy, and we can't do things today, even if it's 50 years down the road, that will destroy this possibility. I'm bringing this in because we have a prime minister who has talked about annexation, and I think these conversations are going to need to be cracked open among American Jews to a much greater extent than they have. Do you have more things that you want to say to this voice that says the status quo is unsustainable and that's not going to have changed in 50 years? Do you have more to say that you want to say about that beyond what you've said already?
Well, I agree with Bennett that the status quo is unsustainable. His solution is not the one I would opt for.
Because?
Well, because that doesn't get any farther toward giving the Palestinian people the dignity that they also deserve. There are two moral, in my opinion, solutions to this conflict. One is two states, and one is a binational state. A binational state certainly does not serve the idea of Jewish democracy. Therefore, the only one left are the two states.
I just would point out that, American Jews have a lot of very strong opinions. We know how Israel should do things better than Israel. But the only thing is, we don't live there. The people of Israel live there. And it's their lives that we're constantly talking about, whether you're talking about the peace camp or the war camp or the right-wingers or the liberal left, it doesn't matter. The people of Israel live there. They just had an election. Now, some people might not be happy with the results of that election, but it was the voice of the people. That's what a democracy is. And, and I think that one of the problems with American Jews, first of all, I do think that there are a lot of ignorant American Jews, especially today on campus. A lot of kids growing up today do not have a sense of Jewish history. They don't really know the facts. And do we have a right to make determinations for the people living in Israel, or do the people of Israel have the right to make those determinations?
But I think I just want to say, one thing I think that just, as a pulpit rabbi, that I'm continually concerned with is what's so interesting to me, and especially about this election. I was saying this in the robing room before. Was I read an article yesterday that it was a poll of 64% of millennials in Israel voted for Bibi, or the right bloc, and the majority. I don't know what the numbers here are in America, but being at Yale, as a Yale Hillel rabbi, and in New York as a rabbi, and now in DC, and millennials that I work with all the time, if not now, and lots of groups that are coming up now about having difficulty relating to the state of Israel because of what they're witnessing. And I think one thing, one of the things that we were talking about tonight is this growing divide between what does it mean to grow up in a state where, from the time that you were born, it was the Second Intifada, and you've never experienced what peace talks can look like. You've never experienced, the opportunity to actually befriend your neighbors. It's something you're reading about. It's something you've ever actually witnessed. And in America, I feel like our millennials are growing up, seems to me, coming out into the world, and we have, I can only speak for the non-Orthodox movements, but one of the things that we push is Tikkun Olam. So we talk about loving, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. What does it mean to get out of your own tribalism, to be particular, to know who you are, to know your own text, but actually to live in a pluralist world? And so it seems to me that there's a growing divide between, sort of the future of American Jews growing up here and what they're seeing, and just from the polls of what I'm looking at, of what happened over the last 48 hours, of what's happening to the youth, and obviously not all youth, but a large majority in Israel. And to me, that matters. Does it mean I vote there? No, but it's something I feel like we have to be concerned about.
And I guess I think you're both right. I think it's true. Israelis have to vote based on the best interests of their country as they see it, and we can't expect them to listen to us and our ideas. If we want to influence, we can go and vote there. But also, I think the trends on the ground in Israel are toxic for American Jewry's sense of identification with Israel, which I think is having a spillover effect on people's identification with Judaism altogether. Israel's so important. It's where half of the Jews live. All our institutions are so supportive of Israel, and if people don't feel proud of Israel or feel even embarrassed or even angry at its government's policies, I think, or if it emerges evolves into a country that can't be considered but reasonably a democracy because the occupation it switches into an annexation and becomes permanent, then I think that will have a horrific impact on American Jewry. And again, Israelis have to make. I don't know an Israeli voter should vote based on a college kid in America feeling proud of being Jewish, but it definitely has that impact. And as American voters, also I think we also can't. We're entitled as well as American citizens to the United States is also a sovereign nation that's entitled to its own foreign policy, and we have also interests.
So I have an anecdote.
I see you're wanting to get in here, and I hear. We need to shift into taking some questions from the audience. However, the first question is one that I think you're already organically speaking to, and you can be the first to respond. So what do you see as the responsibility that American Jews and Jewish leadership and religious leaders do or don't have to advocate for change in Israel, whether regarding religious pluralism or security? This is the way this was written, and I actually want to make it a bit more neutral, and just and to ask you, do you see American Jews having a role to play in relation to peace and security issues? Do you see American Jews as having a role to play in relation to matters of religion and state? Should our preferences matter? Why or why not? How so? How not? So please come in, and hopefully you can respond organically to what they were saying as well. Yeah, please.
Look, I think that if you want to have an opinion, you should also be educated. You watch if you're going to rely on what you see on the news in America, the newspapers, whether they're right-wing papers or left-wing papers, are not fair, because they present their perspective. Same thing in Israel. The newspapers just present their perspective. Education is very important to learn history, objective history, learn the facts. I just tell a brief anecdote. I was on Encounter also, and they took us in East Jerusalem to an English bookstore run by an Arab. And he says, I show everything over here in this bookstore. You can buy English. You can read about the conflict. So I browsed through the books in the bookstore, and I said, do you have any books about the Israeli narrative? So he says, yeah, I have a book, Peter Beinart. I said, well, what about Michael Oren? No, we don't have that book. What I'm saying is, I think American Jews, I think the Palestinians are ignorant of the Israeli narrative. What is I think birthright is a great thing. I think trying to damage birthright is a terrible thing. American kids growing up in this country don't know the Jewish story. They don't have a Jewish education. They go to college campus. There's a lot of propaganda on the college campus, but they don't know objective history. How could you try to influence another country when you don't know the history of that country just because you have a political opinion? I just think it's irresponsible.
I mean, I have to say, I think, respectfully, I think,
okay. You don't have to do it respectfully, or respectfully, disrespectfully, it's okay.
Because I believe in that.
Okay, so do I.
I want to practice it. But I think it's a blanket statement. I think one of the things that I think has been problematic for, let's just say, millennials and having been on a college campus is that I think we say within Judaism, machloket l'shem shamayim, like we believe in disagreement. We believe that disagreeing actually has an effect in the world, right? When we do it in a way that we see other opinions. And I think one thing we've done is that we've said around Israel, our young kids can't bring this stuff up. As a pulpit rabbi, not at Addis, but in other places I've served, it's a very hard thing to talk about because there's one way of looking at Israel, because we don't have a right. But the truth of it is, like, what's happening there happens also in our name. It's one of the major center of what Jewish life looks like comes out of Israel.
Machloket l'shem shamayim, a battle for the sake of heaven. There are two ways of understanding that. The true machloket l'shem shamayim, the true battle for the sake of heaven, was a dispute between two educated people who were on an equivalent level, who had a disagreement. Then there's another thing, and what does it say? A dispute for the sake of heaven will ultimately be fulfilled. That dispute, an educated dispute, will ultimately be fulfilled. So far lehit kayem. But then the other interpretation is a machloket, a dispute which you think is for the sake of heaven, but you have in ignorance, will last forever. And how could you express an opinion about something which you know so little about? We have to educate our kids. The Hillels have to do a better job on campus.
I want to bring other people in here. So, thank you. Josh and David, you can come back to the original question. If you want to, there was a difference that emerged here that in part was an assessment of how much people know and how much they need to know to speak, right? You can speak to that or the original question, which is what is the role for American Jews and American Jewish leaders to play in matters of religion and state, in matters of peace and security?
I'm going to share a tentative thought. This is not a position of mine. This is just a musing that I had one day that I want to share because I think it was a provocative thought that I had, and I want to share it with, I guess, all of you. I was at an event, a Federation executive was saying that when he meets with his Israeli counterparts, when he lobbies the Israeli government, he's very, very forceful on issues of religious pluralism, on the Kotel Compromise, et cetera, et cetera. He feels like that's the role as a representative of American Jewry to push Israel very hard on these issues of religious pluralism, et cetera, that impact us as an American Jewish community. But he tells them, at the end of the day, they know that when it comes to issues of war and peace, we have their back. And that, I think, there's something very intuitive about that position. That's the dominant position. I probably even agree with it. But I had this thought as I'm listening to him. I thought, I don't know, like if the Israeli government wants to designate the Kotel as an Orthodox synagogue, that's not the decision I would make if I were a Knesset member, or it's not the decision I would vote for if I were an Israeli voter. If someone asks me, I think it's a foolish choice to make, but it's a legitimate decision that a democratic government could come to designate a particular site, an Orthodox synagogue. Governments designate sites, synagogues all over the world. That's fine. That's their business. What right do I have to intervene in a decision of that kind? On the other hand, as an American citizen, I'm a citizen of a country that has a foreign policy that acts all over the world, that has policies and positions and works towards, hopefully, just causes more often than not all around the world on behalf of our foreign policy, our national interests, and how can we, and as a voter, how can we defer that to the government of another country, even if it's our brothers and sisters in Israel? So I don't know, I think there's room to interrogate a little bit that clear divide of only Israelis can have a say on issues of their their conflicts with their neighbors. I think the United States intervenes all around the world, and I think we should do so in a just way, in our own interest and in the interest of global stability and peace. And I don't know that we should not apply that just because we like one side more than the other in a particular conflict.
Do you not think that Christian evangelical leaders haven't played a role in the shaping of Israeli policy right now through their support of our current administration and its actions in support of the current leadership in Israel? If the Christian religious community is going to play that sort of role, you bet your boots the leaders of the Jewish community ought to be playing a role as well. I mean, it's not for us to vote in the Israeli elections, but it is for us to raise our voices to say, you're undermining what we're trying to do. We are trying to establish a stronger relationship between American Jews and the state of Israel. Now, our first responsibility, to your point, is to educate our people. Because if they don't understand history, then they are much more susceptible to be taken in by the duplicity that is out there on campus and in many other places. But we also have a responsibility to let the leadership of Israel know that what they are doing, at least right now vis-a-vis the Palestinians, is undermining our efforts to strengthen those connections, particularly among millennials.
So you've moved us organically into prescriptions, and there's a couple of questions here that are about what's giving you hope about Israel diaspora relations, and to talk more about Jews, those who are distancing and being turned off and alienated. What are some prescriptions that might bring them back? So we need to move toward closing, and I'm gonna invite you to say, you can speak to those questions or to anything really that you wanna say at all. In closing, that in terms of prescriptions, calls to action for the audience, what's giving you hope, anything that you wanna say in closing?
Well, I could say something. I'm an Orthodox rabbi, and I agree with David, for example, about the Western Wall. But I don't think, you see, the Western Wall is an example of something where there was a deal, there was an agreement made. I'm on the board of the Western Wall Heritage Foundation, so I know a little bit about the Western Wall. There was an agreement made that there would be, there is a place where people who are not Orthodox can have non-Orthodox services by Robinson's Arch, but there was an agreement made that the people who want to have non-Orthodox services should have access through the Western Wall Plaza to a new plaza that would have been built on the other side of the entrance to the Temple Mount by the Mughrabi Gate. I think, and I actually was involved in making that agreement. I sat with Natan Sharansky at the time at his request, and we worked on it. We worked very hard on it, and there was a deal made. Even the Haredim agreed to it, and then they backed off under pressure. I think you have to honor a deal. That's very bad if the Israeli government doesn't honor a deal because of political pressure in a coalition. So I think a deal has to be honored. Another area where I think a lot of work must be done and can be done, Israel, there's no separation of church and state. So for good or for worse, the Israeli rabbinate, which is an Orthodox rabbinate, the chief rabbinate, has a lot of influence on policies. And one of the big issues that comes up is the policy of conversion and the acceptance of non-Orthodox conversions in Israel. There's a lot of work that could be done on that within the framework of the halakha. If you just have a looser but legitimate interpretation of halachic conversions that would make life a lot easier for American Jews. I think that's very, very important. So I think, and I'm saying this as an Orthodox rabbi, I think there's a lot of room where we could do a lot of constructive things that would be helpful. So I don't know if that's a positive thing to say, but that's what I believe.
I'll give you a positive thing. Israel landed a spacecraft on the moon today. Now, it wasn't a smooth landing. It wasn't a smooth landing, but it was a landing. And one of the things that we need to do is we need to not only talk about the political challenges. We need for our people to understand the marvel that is modern Israel. And we need to take our people there. And we need to help them develop a connection not just to the land, but to the people themselves, and to see the vibrancy of that culture, which is a flourishing democracy. With all of its struggles, it is a democracy, and that is to be celebrated. And if we can do that, and we can do that, we don't have to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to do that. God willing, it'll be solved. We don't have to fully realize religious rights for every Jew in Israel in order to bring our people to Israel. God knows we ought to be fighting hard for religious rights for every Jew in Israel, and that's something that this congregation is certainly passionate about. But we can't just walk away from the land of Israel because it's got problems. We don't walk away from America when it's got problems. What we do is we engage and we work harder.
Amen, amen. We have to go. I think we have to go. I think we have partners on the ground that are doing incredible things in Israel. Masorti, which is the conservative movement in Israel, doing amazing things. We just, Addis just participated with the URJ and the USCJ and Masorti and Iraq, the Israel, I always get it wrong, the Israel Religious Action Center, with Anat Hoffman in D.C., together with Washington Hebrew Congregation, and we married 3 Israeli couples who wanted to, one of the couples was a gay couple, one couple identified as Reform, and so they wanted to be married by our colleagues in the Reform movement, and one couple was a couple, it was a heterosexual couple, and the male in the couple, his mother had converted. He was born in Israel, served in the IDF, and then the Rabbanut told him he couldn't get married there. So they came to America, and they got married here, and we married them. And I feel like the interaction with people who are young Israelis who want to change society and to make it more open and diverse and are willing to do lots of things to use their love, to use their voices, we have to work with them. And I think we have to go. We have to go and be on the land and love the land and learn the history of the land to continue to engage.
I think our main task as American rabbis is to inspire our communities to love Judaism, to study Torah, to love Torah, to embrace mitzvot, to embrace being part of the Jewish community, and to feel themselves as part of the Jewish people that spans the globe and goes back and spans history as well. And if we can do that more successfully, with greater passion, then naturally, then our people will feel responsible for and feel connected to and their cousins, their brothers and sisters, the Jewish people that lives in the land of Israel, and that will naturally lead to cross-pollination of ideas, of Torah scholarship, of cultural ties, and political activism as well. I don't think we should. American Jews shouldn't primarily relate to Israel through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think we should be like 2 or 3 levels deeper than that as well, and really, specific organizations that we love, a theater that we love, a restaurant that we love, and really deeper, thicker ties, and bring our activism into all of those places as well.
So you all have given us a tremendous amount of valuable food for thought and words of wisdom and inspiration, and thank you all.
Hello, my name is David Halpern. I'm the Executive Director of Israel Policy Forum. Please join me in thanking our panelists once again. I think this was an incredibly thoughtful and incredibly important conversation to be having today, and it's the kind of thoughtful, constructive conversation that our community will need to be having more of, I believe, in the weeks, months, and years ahead. Thankfully, we'll be taking this series to Washington, D.C. literally next week at Lauren's Synagogue, Addis Israel in Washington, D.C., next month at Stephen Wise, Congregation Stephen Wise in Los Angeles, and beyond. I know I speak for the ADL and the Israel Policy Forum in that we are committed to providing a platform for our community to come together to have this sort of constructive discourse. I want to thank everyone who's been a part of this important series, especially Shia Lerner of the ADL, Barry Schwartz of Israel Policy Forum, and of course, Erica and Gadi here at the Stryker Center. As we have done for each one of these programs, we will meet, the young professionals will meet to continue the conversation downstairs. And as I've said in the past, if you're not sure if you're a young professional, you're probably not a young professional. Thank you very much again for coming, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.